So I was reading your Asimov's bio, and in it you mentioned a British anthology called Adventure Stories for Girls, which you read over a dozen times as an adolescent. And I'm curious about why this particular book was so formative to you and how it's shaped your lifelong reading interests.
Well, the thing about that book, my parents found it they took a vacation to Bermuda, and they bought it in Bermuda. And what I had, even as a kid, I read every book we lived in a very small town, population 400, but it had a nice little library, but not a big library. And I read every book there, and I really realized after a while that the girls were always rescued. Any situation you put a girl into, if they were in trouble, a boy or a man would somehow resolve the problem. And I really wanted to read. I got sick at one point. They didn't know what was wrong with me, but they put me on bed rest for a while, which actually it turned out maybe worse, because what I really needed was more exercise, and so I got weaker and weaker in bed. But my parents were getting me books, and I was like, I really want books where the girls solve the problems. And when they found this book luckily I was fine later once they figured out that they shouldn't have put me in bed. But so when they found this book, it's a collection really where the girls, for the most part, they resolve the issues. Like even in the school readers, there'd be stories that are always about boys, or if there was a girl, she had to be rescued somehow or other. How princesses always be rescued, whatever. And this book was just filled with stories where girls found themselves in sometimes difficult, sometimes dangerous, sometimes, they had the open windows, Saki, that was the first time I ever read that story, all kinds of girls, but the girls all solved their problems themselves. And it was just what I wanted to read, it was just perfect, because that was just so missing from so many stories, that I had encountered up to that point. Even I love as I was saying, I love the John Carter stories. I love the Princess of Mars, but she's constantly being rescued by John Carter. And there's just that motif, and even now it continues. One of my favorite books in graduate school I was reading for fun was somebody introduced me to An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. And it's an amazing scene in there where she has to rescue herself. And I just love those stories. And yet they seem revolutionary. Why should they be? But they are.
Yeah. It's so cool to hear that, like, they could give you that kind of exposure or sensation of agency at a time when you maybe felt a lacking of that.
Yeah, that was absolutely true. And then, but I was raised to be very independent. My father wanted to have 6 kids, 5 boys and a girl, and he had 4 girls and 1 boy. And I was the oldest, and even though he had plenty of, typical sexist ideas of his time, he also had 4 daughters, and he really envisioned, he was thrilled when I was born, he really envisioned that I would be independent and successful, and I had all these dreams that parents have, but he put them into me too. Like if my brother had been born first, I might not have had that, I don't think he did that with my other 3 sisters. And so I also kind of bought into that, and it's amazing how much you can be formed by, even though looking back on it, he undercut some of that in other ways, but it didn't matter because he at least brainwashed me in a way that I appreciated, and that worked for me, worked very well for me.
You learn a lot by going back and deconstructing some of those mixed messages.
Yes.
So in past interviews that I've read with you, I've picked up on, and correct me if I'm misstating or if I'm wrong about this, but it seems like you have a preference now for digital to print literature, at least with the magazine. And I'm curious about why you have this preference, and how does the experience between digital and gonna defer for you.
I don't know quite what you mean by the question. Do you mean I prefer for me to read, or do you mean for submissions, or?
Yeah, I might be misstating or overstating something that I read, but
Well, we were criticized for a while for being slow to convert to digital submission systems.
that might have been.
And yeah, the reason we were slow was more to do with we didn't have anyone who could do it, and we didn't have the time. We had a lot of obstacles in our way. We weren't like a magazine that was just starting up online, and that's they set about doing that. But then somebody, Mary Robin at Koala, actually told me I ought to talk to Neil Clark about his system. And then Neil volunteered to set up my system for me, and it still took it took a year and a half or something. There were obstacles in the way that you can't even, that the writers would never really know about, but there were all kinds of problems that had to be resolved. And so people were really under the idea, they were always saying things about me that weren't based in any reality, so that I obviously didn't want to change the system because I preferred print submissions or whatever. What I have found, I love my physical magazine. I think it's beautiful. I think it's an art object. But what I love in terms of submissions, it's that you can have it's super organized. I have the name of everyone who submitted a story. I have the name. I can find the story if they send me a title. Whereas before I didn't keep records of 800 submissions. I didn't write down. I wouldn't know when someone sent a story, whether we returned it already. I wasn't handwriting or typing a record of each story. But now that's all done for me. And so and then if I'm reading a story and I think it's got potential, I edit it right away on my computer. So there's all kinds of practical reasons why digital submissions and the digital system is a boon. In terms of reading, I like both. I listen to audiobooks. I read print books. I read print books digitally. I read digital books. It's I like to read. I just like reading. So I don't know that I did go for a while last spring, where I was having some real vision issues. I just had to rest for a while away from this. Sometimes it can be a bit much after a while, but overall, it went away. It was fine after I had a little bit of shifted to other kinds of work. But it's really extremely practical for doing the job. That submission system, and it's so much better for international authors. Don't have to worry about getting American stamps, and even don't have to worry about unreliable postal systems, and so there's so many advantages. And now I get loads of submissions from India and places that I've never got submissions from before because they couldn't submit because it was too difficult to submit via mail.
The costs were probably prohibitive as well.
Expensive, yeah. The paper, the toner, or the typewriter ribbons back in the day, and all those things add up. And this is very, it makes sense on many levels.
So, talking of gestures that probably extend back to the early issues of Asimov's that have been retained through the present. Your issues feature these really beautiful editorials that act kind of as introductions and sometimes kind of thematic explorations or compendiums of the work that's in the issue. And I'm curious, as someone who really appreciates gestures like that, but I don't see those in a lot of present magazines. I'm curious about your process with these editorials, how you decide what to write about, or how you go about finding guests to write the editorials.
That's a very interesting question. I started, when I was taking over as editor, before that editors had done some sporadic editorials. And we always had, when the magazine started up, Isaac Asimov wrote his editorial. He wasn't the editor of the magazine, but the editors who worked with Isaac, to a large extent, didn't feel they needed to do an additional editorial. Kathleen Maloney and John McCarthy did a few, but mostly they were just very practical editorials about something changing in the magazine, or, like Shauna becoming the editor, or, welcoming Gardner as the new editor, and that kind of thing. So as long as, and then Isaac died, and basically we kind of stopped having, for the most part, a few editorials in every so often, but not very many. And Bob Silverberg eventually came on board doing his Reflections column, which is similar to an editorial. When I was starting as the editor, I was talking to Jim Kelly, and he said, Justine Labos, I think I maybe mispronounced her last name, but she had done a study on, I think it's her, somebody had done a study on the magazines that survived the big crash in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
They're huge. And one of the things they had found were the magazines that had editorials that had survived. Now, I think there could be multiple reasons for that. That could be the magazine that the company put the most money into, and they could kill the other ones easily. But whatever reason, he was saying to me, I just think people like to have a rapport with the editor. They like to, feel part of it. Like you bring them in as they're part of the magazine. And I thought, at first I was just going to do one. He was like, you could just do one every couple of months, whatever, But then I actually found I liked doing them. And they are a way to explore ideas and things I've been thinking about for a long time, or they're a way to look at historical issues. And sometimes the ones you mentioned in particular could be that I just can't think of an idea for an editorial, and I'm, what am I going to write about? And then, like the most recent one where I was writing about resilience, it suddenly hit me that so many stories in this issue really are about resilience, and also I had this author who just died, who was someone I consider a really, resilient person, who faced a lot of challenges and really handled them, and I thought, it all just worked together. So that's how that one happened. In terms of, when I started out asking people for guest editorials, I wanted things that, I wanted a way of reaching out to how science fiction relates to our culture and how our culture relates to science fiction. So maybe exploring music and science fiction, or science fiction and music, or exploring, and some people were exploring things like, anime, or just various topics that I wouldn't be an expert on, but I could ask somebody who would know, and then and that has been really, that's fun, and I liked it, and it's also very helpful for me to have somebody write a guest editorial, or reprint a guest editorial right around the reader won't necessarily realize it because the issue won't hit during the holidays, but the work has to be done over the holidays. So I get a guest editorial in during that period of time, then I can devote myself to the other deadlines and actually take a vacation and not feel like crushing weight, oh, I took a vacation, what a horrible idea, because now I've got to rush an editorial and get it done in no time. So, so there are those practical reasons as well. But yeah, and the editorial just gives me so much, it can be really fun. Some of them are just very basic, like these are the Readers Award winners, or I love to do the comments from the Readers Award, because we don't have a letters column anymore because it's not timely. But to be able to put together all the comments from the readers who voted on the award, or to do something on the Down Magazine Award, which is the award that I founded with Rick Wilbur on the best, stories by college students, and then do a piece on reading all of them, and so those are again practical editorials. I have 2 of those a year, but the others, and I really like them too, but they're also they're working for the magazine, really. But then I have fun with, just being able to write about just something that appealed to me, that I wanted to, that I've been thinking about. Like there was one time I had this weird experience. I was walking across the street and I started hearing, which for all the world sounded like a TARDIS landing, you know, in the middle of New York City. And I'm like, where's the TARDIS? You know, looking around. And so then I ended up writing an editorial on having a mom who's a science fiction editor, you know, and taking my daughter to, we were sitting in this really cheap little restaurant in the YMCA when she was little. She was going to go to summer camp. We were waiting for it to start. And some people came up to me. I had the newspaper in front of me. And they said, what's today's date? What's today's date? Because a lot of tourists would stay in the YMCA. And I said, it's the 4th of August or something, whatever. And they said, no, it can't be. It can't be. And I said, well, yes, it is. It says it right here on my newspaper. It's the 4th of August. And they said, oh, no. And they went away. And I said, Irene, do you know who those people were? She said, who were they? And I said, time travelers. So it was a perfect editorial to write about raising, you know, having a science fiction mom raising your kid.
That's amazing. I was going to say, too, like, that's part of the beauty of the editorials is that they situate the issues temporally, like in terms of like what's going on in the moment, like
right.
what's going on that's in conversation with them in the world.
Yes. And sometimes, you know, I've been inspired by an angry letter comes in from a reader who's very upset by something, and then I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And, you know, I'll use that as a basis to jump off of and write my opinion or position on it. You know, it's not trying to humiliate the person who wrote the letter, but just what I think of that. Why I like the story that they hated or whatever, you know. So there's a dialogue with that letter writer, but, you know, there are so many ways to be inspired for an editorial. But sometimes I'm sitting there going, oh my God, I got to come up with an idea. What am I going to come up with an idea? You know, sometimes I have plenty of ideas, and sometimes I'm a little bit running dry. So
sometimes that's how the best ideas happen, though, that last-minute desperation.
Yes, definitely.
You look around you and you look for inspiration in unexpected places. Mm-hmm. So, I've been teaching a class with an organization called Grub Street that's based in Boston. They've all been online synchronous classes, though. But the class I've been teaching is on polishing and submitting your fiction to magazines. It's been a really interesting and illuminating class as someone who is an editor for 2 very different magazines and has been kind of trying to like lift the veil somewhat, right, so to speak, on the editor's side of things. But something all of my students have wanted to know is like, what advice do you have for sending out their work? Like, when you read like the first page, or like you're getting a first impression of something, right, like what jumps out at you and what strikes you?
Okay, so there are certain things like very basic. I think many people know already, but I don't look at cover letters till after I read the stories, because when I get, say I look at a couple of days worth of stories, I basically download 50 stories at a time, and I go through the stories. And so basically what you're going to say in your cover letter is probably no big deal. Keep it short and sweet, or don't bother with one at all, because it's not the cover letter that's going to sell the story to me. So in the story, there's some really basic, silly things, like don't start your story with somebody waking up.
That's what we've talked about a lot.
Even if it's totally germane to your story, if you're a beginning writer, a newer writer without a track record, it's probably not a good idea, because I won't know that when I start that it's a brilliant story. Whereas most of the time, stories start a little too soon. You know, you don't need as much preamble for the editor. You need to start, not necessarily, you don't want to start in the middle of an exploding spaceship necessarily, but you want to start in the action of some sort. It doesn't have to be super dramatic, but you want to be in it. You know, I bought a story from someone I'd never heard of. Was just started off with somebody trying to do somersaults out in the parking lot of a diner and landing on their head. You know, and it was just such an interesting start to the story. You know, it was like, oh, now I'm curious to read further and find out why they were doing somersaults and landing on their head. And the waitress has to bring them in and fix the wound. And that was just and I certainly don't want to see a bunch of stories now like that start with somebody doing somersaults, but it's just the point, you're starting with something that is interesting, that I'll be wondering, oh, where is it going to go from here? And again, as I say, it doesn't have to be super dramatic, it's just interesting, you know, that it's, so again, starting with breakfast, or starting with, or just too much preamble, or even, you know, yes, you could be Bill Gibson and start by describing the color of the sky, and that's a great opening line, but most people that might not be interesting enough to keep you reading. I don't need to know right away what the planet looks like, but you can start working that in later or whatever. You know, there's ways to convey that information that will become interesting as I'm reading along, but might not wow me enough to sustain my interest right in the very beginning. But the important thing with an editor when you're, I mean, it's important even for well-known established authors, but they are experienced at it, so they tend to do it all the time just by second nature. But, you know, if you're starting out and you don't have that much of a track record, you need to break through, and so you want to be different, and you want you to wonder, oh, I hadn't thought of that before. You know, kind of a hook that's just a little different. Even if it's going to turn out to be a time travel story that the theme might not be all that different, but the hook, you want to grab me in a way that I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, I think with a lot of writers who are like still finding their voice, there's a lot of throat clearing that happens when they're just like figuring out a way into the story that they're writing. And like so much of like learning to be a writer is about like figuring out like, why do I begin here? Or
right.
Is this really the beginning that I want to begin with?
I think if you're stuck, write that beginning, but then throw it away. You know?
Yeah.
And I also think that a lot of times look at really good stories by, you know, that are out there that won major awards or were anthologized or whatever. You know, just look at a typical issue of Asimov's, and look at how professional or authors who are starting to sell handled what they, because there's often so much information in the first paragraph that you don't even truly appreciate till you finish the story. And you know, so an author can learn a lot by just taking careful notes on, you know, even if it's just in your head, on what other authors have done. You know, why did that story work so well? You know, take it apart structurally. Oh, you know, not to imitate, but to learn from it. And maybe imitate a little, but mostly to learn from it.
Yeah, that's great advice. So this is a bit of a personal question or curiosity of mine, but we both got our masters at different points in time from Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm very curious. Like, first of all, did you get an MFA or did you get your master's in something else?
I got my master's in philosophy.
Oh,
interesting. I was on a PhD track, but I decided to switch my vocation and my avocation. I said, I want to, my best friend in graduate school had a copy. She said, I wasn't thrilled. I mean, it was a very interesting experience to be in the Washington University Philosophy Department in 1979. But it wasn't very supportive. And it was interesting. I'm glad I did it. But I realized that the first thing they did in 1978 when they sent us a letter of acceptance, apparently it's the only year they ever did it, they made a decision at the American Philosophy Association to send a letter with all the acceptances all over the country saying there are no jobs in philosophy. Now, it was never my intention to get a job in philosophy, but I thought you could use philosophy to do so many other things. And then they told me they didn't like that attitude. They only wanted people there that wanted to be professors. And I was like, well, you just said there aren't any jobs. But I was really glad to get my master's. I really, really learned a lot and had I think it's been extremely helpful to me. But my I had a copy of F&SF I was reading, and my friend said, she knew I wasn't thrilled, and she said, if you could do anything in the world, what would you do right now? And I said, I'd go to New York and get a job on a science fiction magazine. And I, you know, and then I always say, and I did, but of course it wasn't that simple. It wasn't that easy. But, you know, and I have never, but I found myself happier to be working in science fiction and able to read philosophy on the side than studying philosophy and only being able to read science fiction on the side. You know, I found that it was more rewarding for me life to be able to keep, you know, so, you know, my favorite TV show in the past years and years is The Good Place. You know, I still love philosophy. My daughter, alas, I don't know whether it's good there or not, my younger daughter is now a philosophy major. I didn't tell her to do it. I didn't tell her. Irene, on the other hand, has never taken a philosophy class, but my other daughter. But you know, I think I learned a lot about analyzing, taking things apart, putting them back together, and I think it's never been it was never a bad decision that I got that degree. I'm sorry if this is a long-winded answer to your
No,
question.
I love that answer. It ended up having a lot of surprising connectivity. That's very cool.
And it was fun to be in St. Louis at that. St. Louis was cool. I mean, I used to go hang out at Blueberry Hill almost every night. A good friend of mine was a waitress there and a graduate student in philosophy. But you know, there was a wonderful. This was before, you know, everything was on a stream. There was no such thing as streaming, obviously. So it was a great movie theater that did all kinds of. You know, I saw amazing French and German and all kinds of movies there. And, the other students were wonderful. You know, so there was, and you could go out in that campus in the middle of winter and see so many stars. It was, you know, it was a very cold, couple of very cold those winters as well as Missouri, and it was just beautiful sometimes, you know, looking up at the sky in the middle of Missouri, not the middle of Missouri, the edge of Missouri, but so there were many rewarding things about it.
I guess I'm curious about the mechanics of the magazine, or like how it's evolved in your experience over the years, because you've seen it in a lot of different permutations, I imagine.
I think that I wanted to, you know, there's a lot. I think what I'd like to, you know, the magazine it's a great place for both, you know, you can find your favorite authors, but you can also find brand new writers. We're always looking. I have to constantly find new people because I lose you know, I find someone and I publish the first few stories and then they sign a novel contract, you know, or they get a different job, or they have, you know, kids, whatever. They fade away for a while and then they come back, but sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. So I'm constantly looking for new blood, as it were, you know, new voices. Also, it does keep everything interesting and different constantly, bringing, you know, new people. But it's partly very selfish on my part. I've got to keep it going. I've got to keep finding. So I'm very open to finding the new, you know, new writers, new perspectives, new themes, new, you know, whatever. And I also think, you know, paying for subscription for a magazine is a positive thing, because you are supporting all the staff, not just the writers, but all people. There are so many people involved in putting the magazine together. I mean, obviously myself and my managing editor, Emily Hockaday, do the huge bulk of the work, the production work, and the editing work. But there's also people involved on many other levels in terms of, you know, IT and subscriptions and advertising and you know, distribution, and there's so many things going on, and I think it's important for to, you know, to support all of that that gives us the opportunity to bring these great little gems to the readers, you know, so there's a reason why it costs money to read these magazines. And so I think, and then writers I mean, the digital submission subscriptions do very well, and they're great, especially if you live, say, in Australia. You get the issue right away. You have to wait 2 months for your magazine to show up. But writers do love having a print copy to show their mom. They love, you know, that their work is there. They can put it on the shelf, and someone comes over for dinner, they can say, look, I have my story in this. You know, it's not just up in the ether of the...
Yeah, it's something tangible.
Yes.
It's like a trophy.
Yes, and so I delight in all of that. That to me is really, and of course it has that whole history that science fiction and fantasy kind of come out of this, you know, the pulp magazines of the 20s and 30s and 40s, you know, we were never pulp. We were never made out of pulp paper, you know, despite everyone calling us pulp magazines. But we come from that tradition, and I do love that. I love the continuity of it, that this, really the 20th century kind of engendered it, and then it's continued, and it's developed and changed and morphed and everything else, but it's still, there's a historical connection to it at the same time.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about the magazine is its awareness of that tradition. Like, there's this wonderful archive of all the old covers, and you can almost see visually see the evolution of the magazine through the years with those covers.
Yes, yeah, those are very interesting, and they will show what way were people looking at in that time.
Yeah.
You know, what was considered sort of cutting edge, or and it always changes because cutting edge has to change. There's
Would you say that's a big part of what's kept you at the magazine, like that sense of discovery and kind of sharing that sense of discovery?
Absolutely. My job, I have been there now, I was hired in a different department with my eye on editorial in 1981, December of 81. But I moved at Asimov's in late June of 82. So this past June was my 40th anniversary on the magazine. But there's been so many changes, I mean, I was at some level of assistant for 22 years, and I've been the editor for 18. And when I was managing editor, we brought in desktop publishing and had to relearn everything and really take over it first. At first I was doing most of the production work. Not that we had more of an art department then, but I was doing all the typesetting type stuff once we had desktop publishing, and then, or a lot of it anyways, and then they moved in, they changed so that we would have a type department do some of it, but yet I still end up doing every page. I still turn every page to look the way I want it. I write all the blurs, but I put them all in, and I decide on the size of the headings, and I decide on how big, what the space is going to be for the poetry, and I love, and I've had to learn so many new things. And 2 weeks ago they just upgraded my computer and I have to learn a whole new core program. Everything has changed in this new one, and they can't even do some things I used to be able to do it. So annoying, but I am learning, and again it's a challenge, and it's fun. It's great because everything has kept it fresh and constantly. That I've had to pick up all these different skills constantly has kept it fresh and different, and that's very rewarding. And of course the fiction has too. If it was still exactly the same as the stories we were publishing in 1985, and those were wonderful stories in 1985, but if they were exactly the same stories, they wouldn't be so wonderful. We'd just be rehashing ideas that were new and fresh then. So it's important. That new. So I'm both pleased that I'm still having to learn new ways to put out a magazine, and I'm pleased that I'm still constantly reading great work, new work from people. So both of those are rewarding, very rewarding. It's a job that I love. I was having my hair done before I came to WorldCon, a new hairdresser, and he said, I said I was going to a convention, and I said I was looking forward to it, and he said, oh, you're not looking forward to it? And I went, because I think he was just assuming that's what I'd said. And I said, no, I'm really looking forward to it. I love going to my conventions. And he was like, what do you do? I'm like, oh my God, no, WorldCon is one of my favorite things in the world to do. I really miss them. So, yeah, it's a great career.
Yeah, that's so inspiring and reaffirming to hear about anything lasting for 40 years anymore.
I know. It's a little, my daughter would say to me, Irene, she would say, I don't know if you should come to the Grinnell in New York evening, Mom, because you're scary. You're doing, everybody wants that job that is their dream job, that they set as their dream goal, and they went after it and they got it, but you did that and you're terrified, you know, and I'm like, oh, sorry about that.
It's so interesting that she says you're terrifying. Is it just like, why does she say that?
Well, because sometimes, you know, I would not say to a person who came to me and said, you know, do you think I should become a science fiction magazine editor? I wouldn't say you should follow in my footsteps. There are no footsteps to follow in. And there's, for one reason, there are fewer jobs, and I have a salary and benefits, vacation time, you know, paid vacation time, paid benefits, and you know, this is so much more rare, certainly for short fiction nowadays, that I would be hesitant. I would say, so you can't follow in my footsteps because it's just so unlikely. But then on top of that, some things are just, there's just no direct trajectory. I'm sure if you talk to every single editor of science fiction magazine, you'll find they have a totally different trajectory to where they ended up, you know, because it's not a, it's not like saying, oh, I want to be a, you know, even I want to be a movie editor. You know, okay, so go to NYU and take these courses and make these connections, and you can tell people something, give them some advice that might work, but it's a lot different with science fiction and fantasy publishing. You know, it's so much more. So much of it is just your passion and time and place. And it's just, you know, so it's hard to. I can't give anyone a recipe for how to do it. I guess that's why it's scary.
That's a good thing to
Well, thank you for inviting me to do this. It's really interesting. I mean, I love to talk to you, and I'd love to talk to you more later.
Absolutely. No, this was